Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks very much. And thank you to the Backbench Business Committee for granting us this debate. This gathering today is a real coming together of the all-party parliamentary group on childcare and education, which I chair, and fights for the private voluntary independent sector, otherwise known as the PVI, with the APPG on nursery schools, nursery and reception classes, which does good work campaigning for maintain nursery sector. I think we will hear shortly from my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, who's one of the vice chairs of that group, but I would just also mention the honourable member for Birmingham Erdington, who's unable to take part today, but is also very much involved in that group and was one of the co-sponsors of securing the debate. So these two parts of the sector are distinct, but they share the same issue, one of grave concern for what the future holds, to be honest. As a constituency MP, I'm fortunate enough to represent both. So it's a mature, but it must be said, struggling PVI sector with providers such as Kingsworthy Preschool, St Paul's, Colden Common, Compton and Shawford Preschool, to name just a few. There are many, many others. I thank them all for making me so properly aware of this sector in the first place and its challenges. Alongside, it must be said, my brilliant wife, who is a qualified Level 3 practitioner. So I hear it very, very clearly. But I also have Lantern's maintained nursery school in my patch, and I thank the head teacher there, Lindsay Falkingham, for her consistent and very focused contact with me. Let me start with some positives. I think we all very much welcome the fact that the government committed to an increase in early years education investment in last week's spending review. It's another example that this government recognises the crucial role that early education has on improving future attainment and, it must be said, economic success for the wider economy. As one of my constituency providers put it to me in an email this morning, I hope that in your debate you're able to put across to the House the importance of sound early years care and education. The future of our country, our leaders, our doctors, engineers, teachers, key workers, rests in the hands of early years teachers and practitioners. I shall do my best. I think I speak for many when I say that we feel our childcare providers really have been the fourth emergency service during the pandemic, caring for the carers and helping the helpers. This has been so important in keeping the show on the road, and it shows how important it is we support this sector going forward. As the National Day Nurseries Association say in their excellent recent report, a plan for jobs needs a plan for childcare. Sticking with the good news, it's very, very good. The government is implementing our manifesto promise to provide the 30 hours of funded childcare each week for parents of 3- and 4-year-olds, which should increase the availability of affordable early education provision. But just because it's the right policy doesn't mean it's without unintended consequence. Furthermore, let me say I do really appreciate the Chancellor meeting with me and representatives from the Childcare and Early Education APPG in Downing Street recently to discuss making childcare more accessible and affordable across the PVI sector. And we did that, Ms Ali, because we cannot duck the fact there remains a serious underfunding issue here, which has, unfortunately, been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a sector which I have described before in the House as experiencing a form of market failure. And I stand by that, but I would add today that it's potentially a social failure too if we get this wrong. The reality is that financial implications have often meant closures in the most disadvantaged areas, as they've been forced, often unsuccessfully, to cross-subsidise their income with parental fees. And the sector has struggled to make ends meet for years, and many providers feel they have reached the end of the road as we reach the end of 2020. By September last year, so well before the pandemic hit, we saw a 153% increase in nursery closures since 30 hours was introduced. In essence, we've delivered one part of sustainability for the future, but we now need to finish the job by increasing funding for settings to a sustainable level. Many of the providers that I speak to discuss market failure with me, and I think that's little wonder, with 25% of providers across the country now potentially facing permanent closure within the year. And recent research has found that 72% of maintained nursery schools expect to end the year in deficit, raising the risk of further closures in the maintained sector too. It is the case that the whole sector faces a real challenge, not only because of the effects of the pandemic, but more importantly because of an unsustainable position at the heart of the sector's funding, which we've got to rectify. And this issue affects every member of the House. It's good to see such a turnout today on a cold and wet Thursday afternoon. The impact that it'll have across our country is stark if we get this wrong. I would argue that we need a complete overhaul of the current system to ensure some long-term sustainability in the sector, as well as value for taxpayers' money. And prior to COVID, it was estimated the funding gap for the early years sector was some £824 million. And at that point, there was already a 37% funding deficit between the hourly cost of delivering a funded 2-year-old childcare place and the rate then paid to providers. And that's a 20% funding deficit for 3- and 4-year-old places. So that is not a sustainable position for the long term. And these figures are based on pre-COVID occupancy rates. And settings are still struggling, despite now being allowed to remain open to care for and educate our children. The funding gap has had a cumulative effect as the years have gone by. And I passionately believe that addressing this would go some way towards reversing that market failure that I speak of and the pattern of closures that we all too often see. In short, what I'd like to see is a funding mechanism that increases funding rates in line with the rising costs of delivering childcare. We've got statutory wage rises, increases in pension contributions, and inflation rates all erode the balance providers must maintain in order to remain financially viable. So whilst the £66 million increase in early years spending this financial year that was announced at the 2019 spending round was obviously a welcome cash injection, sadly, many settings saw it as a real terms funding cut once the inflation rates and the minimum wage rise in April had been taken into account. And I've heard this over and over again. Financial constraints also mean that nursery owners are largely unable to offer their staff the sort of long-term career progression and incentives for upskilling and gaining qualifications. We heard very powerfully about this at a recent meeting of RAPPG. Now, COVID has, of course, had a particularly savage impact for the sector, with increased costs and decreased revenues for many settings. We've got a decline in occupancy rates, and child places has been met with increased costs to make the settings that are open safe, with PPE and additional cleaning that is obviously necessary. So with just a quarter of providers saying that they expect to make a profit between now and March 2021, we've got to take action to protect them for the future. The spending review last week saw a pledge from the Chancellor of £44 million of additional spending on early education, on top of the money confirmed in 2019. This is good news, of course. These vital funds will increase the hourly rate paid to providers for the government's free hours offer, and it is a step also towards sustainability for the sector. But the underlying problems, I would argue, with structural funding and distribution by local authorities remain acute and will continue to remain unless they're properly addressed. An independent, meaningful review into the current system for childcare and early years funding will give us the chance to address the underlying systemic problems with the early years national funding formula to ensure some long-term sustainability. When it comes to the maintained nursery sector, well, 4 years after the introduction of the early years national funding formula I mentioned, they're still waiting for stopgap funding to be replaced by a long-term formula which addresses the historic discrepancies and fund all nursery schools viably. Now, the announcement of £60 million supplementary funding for maintained nursery schools in 2021-22 is hugely welcome. The crucial next steps are, first, for that funding to become a permanent part of the early years funding settlement, not a year-by-year add-on. It is adding huge stress to the people who run these settings to be in such uncertain terrain. And second, for it to be distributed on an equitable basis across the country, not as present on the basis of historical precedent. It's crucial that future funding arrangements for maintained nursery schools adequately provide for them to meet their statutory obligations as schools, which they are, for instance in relation to funding for additional costs such as the well-deserved Teachers' Pay Award. So while that extra funding, the £60 million, is very welcome, it's clear here too a long-term sustainable financial solution must be found for the sector as a whole. For all providers, the early years national funding formula can be if we're being polite, something of a minefield. Requirements and entitlement distributions differ greatly across different local authorities, and that creates a very complex funding context for providers operating in one region, let alone several. It's complex, it's bureaucratic and incoherent, and we often hear those words. That makes a tough job even harder. The current system must work better for settings, for parents, but also for the taxpayers, our constituents. Cash for funded entitlement places relies on local authorities estimating demand and then on them making corrections to this rough draft partway through the financial and the academic years. And this has created an unhelpful culture of large contingency funds and underspends of taxpayers' money that isn't providing the childcare provision that it's meant to and isn't supporting the settings it's meant for either. So we often see millions of pounds intended to deliver funded childcare places is either redirected into other parts of local authority education budgets, or it's held in reserve to cover the inconsistencies that emerge throughout the year as they try to flatten things out. A Freedom of Information request to all English local authorities found that 3/4 of councils had underspent their early years allocation. I am coming to a conclusion, Chair. And this amounts to more than £65 million failing to reach providers for eligible children. It showed that contingency budgets of up to £32 million were being held to allow for funding corrections this year. This is taxpayers' money, and we've got to do better. So I believe that urgent reform to safeguard the future of nurseries and early years settings across the PVI and the maintained sector is desperately needed for all the reasons that I've set out today. This will ensure better value for money for the taxpayer, maintain this vital early education, particularly for disadvantaged children who need it most, and protect the jobs of 360,000 people who work in the sector. The vast majority of them are women, while also enhancing their career development prospects. For me, this is an issue of social justice. I'm very pleased that ministers are working with us to do all they can, and I know this minister will take on board the concerns I've highlighted. We've shown we can work together to protect the health throughout the pandemic. It's time we work together to protect the long-term future of our education system, and that needs to start with early education. So let's get it right from the very start. Thank you very much.
Thank you.